I'd like to ask you first where you are. Are you in London or where? Countryside?
I'm in Sussex.
In Sussex.
Right
And I am in Italy. I just always like to say where people are, just, I don't know, as a thing. But anyway, thanks everyone for tuning in. This is the final episode of this season of Artist as Consultant, and we would like to congratulate all the previous speakers that we've truly enjoyed. So we feel a bit of pressure because they've been so great. And also thank you, E-WERK and Helen Turner, for hosting, coordinating, and just making this a really great experience. So I'd like to introduce the title of today's conversation with the artist Kira Freije, who will be part of the exhibition program at E-WERK next year. And the title that together we've chosen for the conversation today is Terms and Conditions, which, if anyone has tuned in hoping to learn more about legal aspects or kind of agreements and terms of service, that's not quite what we're going to be talking about. But equally, I'd like to say that, we have identified also, aspects of the negotiations and conversations and just more generally the relationships that surround creative practice in connection to the idea of providing a service, which is not news in the sense that Andrea Fraser, for example, in the 90s presented this kind of landmark lecture about, how to provide an artistic service, and how she pointed out already back then, the kind of very, the dependence is the very condition of artist autonomy. So in this sense, we were kind of fascinated with how terms and conditions is a sort of prepackaged expression with this very kind of utilitarian nature, is kind of like a combination of words that seem to lose much of their qualities when they're put together. So instead of taking the terms and the conditions apart, we thought of this as a way also to address aspects of Kira's work. So thinking about terms very much as words and language, and then, conditions also in the sense of, describing what surrounds us, conditions of absence, conditions of presence. And in that sense, I'd like to then give the floor to Kira and, trying to maybe even introduce some of the ideas around, framework and boundaries and conditions of your creative process.
Thank you, Stella.
Thank you for listening to my very lengthy introduction.
And well, thank you for being in conversation with me, and to reiterate, thank you to everyone at E-WERK and the team for having us. But so, as you've defined, thinking about terms as language and conditions as the sort of creative boundaries, I guess I'm going to think about the way I use terms or language in the sculpture I make, and how language informs, in a way, what I do. I think that the relationship between poetry and sculpture is particularly important to me, increasingly so, and the comparative structures that the two crafts share, especially when I'm thinking about constructing new groups of work, which is kind of how I construct things thinking about a whole. Probably I've said to you before, Stella, I'm a frustrated writer or poet, and that if I could write poetry or fiction, I would, and I really can't. But I've been excited.
I'm jumping in. It's just that reminds me a lot of something that Enrico David, with whom I worked on the Italian Pavilion last year, once said to me. I think we were at dinner or something. It wasn't a formal conversation, but he just mentioned something that really stuck with me about how if he could write what he's trying to say or express, he would write it. And in that sense, also sculpture is I don't know if I would say it's a condition of in language, but it's a kind of there's a connection there in terms of being a form of expression that you choose also because of that, you know, that being your craft and not language being your craft, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I'm also quite interested in also the comparison between the creative processes of poets and myself as a sculptor. And but I guess that sort of, in a way, the frustration of maybe not being able to, you know, that my craft is thinking through objects in a way, is that actually I can accept that I can get closer to achieving something like the melody or rhythm of the poetry that I admire most by like building my physical work, but always with a consciousness and an inclusion of the poetic language. And I think that in that way, I've sort of come to kind of really deeply acknowledge that language, as much as say metal, which is a material that I predominantly use, is as valuable a material and building block for each of my sculptures. And I think probably it's helpful to sort of expand on the way I construct my work. I definitely see myself as a gatherer of materials from many different sources, a lot of from a scrapyard, offcuts from previous works. I always keep everything, and found objects, you know, cam belts that have fallen off mopeds on the street, or disused liquor bottles, or car coolant parts that I've found, for instance. But, you know, so there's that sort of sense of physical material. Then there's also more purposefully gathered or created material where I might cut down from a stock set of metal that I get in, you know, cut tube into a very particular angle of like pie slices, and I'll, you know, repeat that process 80 times to form a circuit work that I do. Or I'll repeatedly plasma cut a leaf shape 200 times, that each one will be different, but not necessarily with an exact purpose in mind, but a loose purpose, and those will kind of become part of the grouping of the gathered material. Equally, I work with a glass blower. I don't work with many external fabricators, but a glass blower is, I've formed a relationship with a glass blower who I go to and will work for a day. And again, there'll be a kind of loose idea of what I want to form in that day, but, you know, it will come about, it will change in its making, and it will, whatever I end up with, the kind of forms, they will sort of also join to be amassed in this collection in my studio that have been gathered. And so that sort of set of more premeditated material gathering, I think, is still sort of the same plane as the found material or the discarded material, because they're all gathered and formed within a similar impulse and intuition for a group of work. But I suppose what's important is that while I'm amassing the materials for a group of work, I'm sort of at the very same time doing the same thing with words. So I'm amassing groups of words, short sentences that exist in my sketchbook, mostly for my eyes, or loose, you know, they'll be written on scraps of paper pinned on my studio wall. Occasionally they become a physical text work of a sculpture, but mostly they become the titles of work. And I think if I'm going to be very generous to myself, maybe accepting the limits of myself as a frustrated poet or writer, actually I've kind of worked out the way of turning that frustration into a positive, and giving myself kind of these one-liner poems as titles, allowing myself that, and thinking of them as poetry. And very much,
I'm gonna jump in. Can you read us a couple of your previous titles?
I can show you some images.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, share screen. I think this works. tell me if this works.
Yes, I can see you were looking up Richard Ginori on eBay.
Oh no, that's not right.
Let's see, but
Oh my God, how do I do this?
I'm surprised. I'm joking. Ready?
Can you see?
Yeah. I see one of the standing works.
Yeah,
Or
okay.
in the ones I kind of consider like open gates.
Can you see she runs alongside her mother?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll whiz through a few and you can see this is a show title which I'll come back to actually.
Will you read it?
Mouthing living undetected on breeze or breath. Leadership and separation. Often when I'm making groups of work though as well, these words will repeatedly be in the background. So they'll be on the scraps of paper in the studio, but also I'll write them slightly like a mad person repeatedly and repeatedly. So when I was making this group of work, leadership and separation was a very present set of words and language around the whole body of work. This was for an exhibition at Mackintosh Lane in 2018, I think. She came in and never left, one step from death, a meteorite without fire.
Which was from your graduation show. It was a really fantastic piece.
That was, yes.
That was also in connection to, you might have to help me out here, my memory is failing me, a book that you and I actually talked about a lot.
Carol.
That book.
Price of Salt. Yeah, I was, I'm still quite obsessed with Patricia Highsmith and the sort of idea of creating suspense and a thriller, but like a love thriller, which Carol, or it was first published as Price of Salt, was one of the most, I think, an incredible book if you haven't read it, but because it achieves this sort of unusual parallel, being a sort of thriller, but a love story at the same time. This is a work, Fallen Woman, and this actually more unusually came probably from a little piece of writing of an imagined sort of woman fallen from the sky and getting caught on a London drain pipe. And this had a motor inside it that would, at random intervals, inflate, and it would sort of fall back slightly coquetting.
Oh, sorry. I think there was sorry, I think there was a delay for a moment. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to ask, what are the materials? Is it rubber?
The legs are made from inflatable, what they use sort of for bouncy castles.
Right.
And the rest is steel and stainless steel with a small industrial inflatable motor inside. These are some more recent works, lamp works, To Open Slowly Where the Gap is Bridged and the Crescent Falls, and Flying Fingers Settle and a Line over Potholes to Sound the Notes of a Silent Home.
Lovely work.
Water Lilies, You Cannot Travel But Your Friends Can. Standing Woman, Arms Folded, it's a text work in the back there. We strike a match at the very same time to signal our own unique unity. And then on the right, Holy Woman. These were from my degree show as well in 2016.
We showed those. We did show those together as well in a group show that we made as part of Beloufa's wider group show in Paris. I think that's the installation shot from. Yeah, that was a very fun time to work together immediately after graduating. It was an exciting thing to do. This was Beneath the Mud. These aren't in any order, by the way. I'm sorry, I'm just going to try and go through. Despite the tides, she foiled the waves and came to be the last. This was a show title companion to a fall at Turf Projects in Croydon, an amazing project space.
this is actually sort of, maybe I think about my work often. I have, or I, as much as in my studio I have images of artist work that I admire, I also have poetry that I repeatedly return to. Elizabeth Bishop, this one, and not usually, but on this occasion I'd say these light works were particularly drawn from this. Actually, it was an unpublished poem where I love this image of talking about the kind of ominous wires and the relationship to a sort of changing love.
So what is this image that we're looking at of the text? Is that a scan from
That's
the
a
original
scan
manuscript?
from the original, not that I have the original, just from a book of Elizabeth Bishop.
I wasn't sure if that was maybe something in the short that you retyped out, but I get it. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, I guess. I mean, we can even keep looking at images if you're good at multitasking. I don't know if I would be able to.
I'm not so good at multitasking.
Tell me if I'm about to ask something that is not convenient, because we can revise how we do it. But I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting to see images of your works, and I was going to ask you to maybe even talk a little bit about how this relationship with poetry expresses itself also in the kind of relationships around your work that you invite in, such as inviting a poet to write the text for your exhibition, which brings me back a little bit to that idea of the terms and conditions of, for example, a solo exhibition, where it's part of that expectation to provide interpretation material that will kind of spell out what's going on in the show. And I think it's an interesting choice that I don't know, I'm going to say you withdrew from that, but I don't mean to seem judgmental by saying that. Is not that you didn't want to that you were not generous. I think you were generous with another form of language, perhaps. And I don't know if you just want to say, maybe we could even read that text by Vanessa.
Yes, so you're referring to an exhibition I had last year in London at Soft Opening Gallery, where rather than the kind of maybe usual press release type text, I asked my very good friend, the writer and poet Vanessa Onwumezi, to collaborate and form a poem around the work I was making, and that's sort of become a really interesting and important exercise, because it's also, I think I mentioned this idea of being quite interested in the comparative creative process that a writer might have to a sculptor like myself. And I think Vanessa and I share a lot of similarities in that we, Vanessa, I think, finds that language is a bind, and that we maybe just move words around, and that actually, language is a similar construction and constraint just as material is. And, I think that what Vanessa kind of speaks about really rings true, which is that she tries with her poetry, and I will read the piece she wrote. What she tries to expose is that she will kind of work with sentence structure in a more nonsensical way to try and expose that linguistic material for what it is, which is a building block, rather than mistaking it and honouring it as something that's unchangeable or fixed. And although we're always going to be bound by the limitations of language, just like the physical limitations of material, it's in that possibility that we can shift the material, that we can reassign its content, that's what's really exciting about making work. I mean, that's what drives me, and I think drives Vanessa. And it's even more in the way that it's possible to achieve that I think is a kind of outcome or a clear path, is that this sort of, in order to achieve that, you have to kind of accept and trust the vitality of the intuitive or the accidental. And I think that's sort of interesting when we think about the idea of conditions and how we maintain our conditions to make work. I'll read the poem, but maybe that's something we can think about as well, Stella, of this idea of maintenance and conditions. And I know that well, I'll read the poem.
Read the poem, no, but we can link to some ideas that we've discussed recently, also in preparation to this talk. Definitely there's some examples that come to mind in terms of that connection between a text which is a sculpture and a sculpture which is a text. But let's read the text maybe, and then.
Am I still sharing the screen?
No, I think right now your screen is not shared, but let me know if I need to give permission. I think I've released any control. Okay. Yeah, that's it. I can see your screen now.
So.
Not yet.
So, loving that which is absent, they and they love, the object loves and knows where to kneel, the dust, the red glass, red, the substance, red earth arched into form, red sulphur, red blood, red cover of a book perched on the edge of a table, red arrow pointing in 4 directions, one to home, the red, one to the dead who are absent in white clay, to the living, above water, and to that which is most absent, more absent than the dead. A violent situation. A hand can only grasp amidst the movement of a few muscles, and it grasps nothing. A red eye flickers into the dark absence in search of the substance. Brush away, raise a finger to the wind. Brush aside. With the back of the hand. The first sweep will be a cleansing, the second a revelation. The substance will grasp. Metal replaces the white eyes and replaces the body or flesh we are accustomed to see walking. Bore me a hole to see, the last hole through which to see, which if nothing it is grey or silver. Cut through with a sharp tool, tool on metal makes a good noise. We know then, it is present. When a hammer strikes a nail, it is present, at the cutting edge of the blade. It is, that which the hand will fail to grasp, emerges from silence, falls into silence, again. A hollow noise, and such is. Of knowing, of the serpent's forked tongue, a split road pointing one way towards the white clay, mouldable, and one towards the living. At the end of both roads, hear the hammer, bolt and nail, driven down by the weight of mud, earth, of gravity. A hollow noise expresses that which is absent. Again, the indelible absence endured under breeze, under breath.
Fantastic.
I think Vanessa does this thing where you can see she has these sort of extended gaps that are quite a peculiarity in her work, and they reoccur in her poems and her short stories. And I think, you mentioned absence earlier. I think, what she's doing with that gap is enacting absence. And
yeah, I've noticed that, and I love it also from the point of view of how sometimes in literature, if you wanted to enhance this idea of suspension, writers would use the ...
Mm-hmm.
And I remember actually reading, you might have to fact check me on this, but I think Elena Ferrante wrote an essay on different forms of punctuation. She was writing a series of essays that were published on The Guardian for about a year, I think a couple of years ago. And in one of these, she sort of argued against ... She felt it was actually a way to remove oneself from also the courage or the work and the effort to say things how they are. Sometimes it's a way to sort of throw the responsibility onto the reader, and I've started to really notice that in my own writing, which is not poetry, in the kind of everyday writing, when I write work emails or text or emails to friends. And I found that the ... somehow became a bit lazy. It's almost to say, you know, I'm not going to make it, ... And so thinking about the gaps and the spaces and the absence that you've pointed out, Vanessa's writing, I think the beauty of that is that it's not, it's a very conscious pose. It's almost, you know, spatially kind of equivalent to that moment where I imagine walking in the space from one sculpture to the next, almost is that moment where you're gathering thought and kind of about to connect to the, you know, next, the next thing, if that makes sense. It's very powerful. It's a kind of presence that implies absence and vice versa. They kind of have to go together.
Yeah, I think it, in a way, the idea of absence formed quite an important part of our collaboration, in that we never, this is the exhibition for which that text was written, and I never asked Vanessa what she was going to write, and she never, you know, pushed me to aggrandize what I was doing or making. Just, I would rather point to the details. So in actual fact, kind of everything grew out of the absence. The collaboration grew out of the absence. And I think the thing that actually we've both found is quite a wonderful connection in the way our process works is that we both sort of I start a body of work and Vanessa starts a story or a poem with not a clear plan of what it's going to be, but really the only thing that there is maybe is that for Vanessa there's an idea of rhythm, and for me there's always an idea of pacing. And so that kind of connection of a sort of overview, but that allows everything to form from the absence within it, is kind of what is, you know, I think that was a good collaborative sentiment. And I think even the way this show was set up feels that, you know, I think I can, you know, you can hopefully feel that, the idea of pacing.
Yeah, no, completely. Hello everyone, apologies, we had a technical glitch, so we're back on and we're gonna continue from where we left. We were discussing Kira's exhibition soft opening, and so I'm gonna give the floor to Kira to pick the conversation up from where we left it. I think you were talking about the kind of idea and rhythm, the idea of rhythm in relationship to space, both in your work and in Vanessa's text that she was invited to write by you for the show.
Yes, and I'm going to share that screen again. And
so when we read the text, I think we were looking at a kind of collage of words and
yes,
yeah, this is what I wanted to see again, just because we haven't kind of delved into any of the details, but I would like to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about this visual composition.
You see, so this is probably a equivalent to how I sort of make my studio board. It always, in my studio, I have a big kind of wall of writing, poems, images, other artist images, and I think here I find forming equivalents is very useful and inspiring, I guess, that I have brought together Vanessa's text with a part of T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets that I've, particularly this part, I've been reading a lot recently, and then alongside an image of one of my sculptures in process from the studio, and Barbara Hepworth's series of surgeon's drawings. But just always find it helpful to, again, kind of gather sources and put them together. So in this way, but so
I was gonna suggest maybe it's interesting to, that you mentioned Hepworth, and I just wondered if in this relationship between text and artwork, are there any other artists that are important to you that you look at? Just sort of, I like asking artists who their artists are.
Yeah, there's quite a long list of artists, but I think someone that I had spoken about to you recently, who was a kind of new discovery of the past year, is Rosemary Mayer. I knew about her sister, the poet Bernadette Mayer, already, who I really love, and there's actually quite interesting comparisons between the two, but I've been looking a lot at Rosemary Mayer's. There's a book that shows excerpts from her journal as well that she kept, which was really interesting, where she would kind of record her daily activity that was generally sometimes quite mundane and descriptive, but within that there'd kind of be bolts of insight that and also insecurity that is very reassuring as to read.
What was the purpose of this kind of diary keeping? Did she ever explain?
I don't know actually, but I think that there was the
work. Grounding moment.
What was you saying?
No, sometimes I guess it can also just be a grounding moment.
Grounded, yeah, it feels that way. Like it feels like a kind of voicing of often of insecurities, but artistic thinking as well. But the work that has always struck me that I found out about by being that was in a group show I was in at Ljubljana Gallery in Berlin. And by the way, there's a solo show of Rosemary Mayer's work on there now, which I wish I could see. So if anyone who's watching this is in Berlin or going there, don't miss it. But what I'm referring to is these noise drawings that Rosemary Mayer made in 2001, where she recorded, she basically set a time frame from that she would listen from outside her studio window and record within a kind of grid structure, using different coloured pencil, each randomized noise that she heard. So there was a kind of grid that was set, but within that grid there was complete and utter freedom in the kind of, and lack of control in the randomness of what would occur. So a scream or a grinder noise or a, car brake screaming, and you ended up with this amazing kind of patchwork of wild, uncontrolled activity that actually should be quite mundane. It makes me think also, I suppose that's where I would maybe compare her to her sister Bernadette Mayer, who writes a lot of sonnets and adheres to the 14-line sonnet structure, but within that, they're really wild, amazing poems, which I highly recommend having a look at.
Well, that's amazing. I guess, yeah, it's interesting to imagine the soundscape of that time and what does noise drawing would look like if they were made, right now, and where.
Yeah.
Where was she based? Sorry, you might have said it.
In New York.
Yeah.
And I guess that thinking of that idea of structure, kind of conditions and structure being sometimes necessary to form a lack of control or intuition, or give permission for the accidental.
Yeah. This is amazing, and I wonder, does it connect at all with what you're working on for your exhibition at E-WERK, or can you say anything about what you're working on for next year's show?
It, again, kind of like I was saying, that there's only an idea really of pacing and a title, which is "The Throat is a Threaded Melody," and so for me, it's really just an idea of the pacing being this sort of thought of a kind of lump or gulp in one's throat, but also this idea of like a kind of repetitive pounding of a train's movement, and the connection between those two, that bodily and that mechanical movement. I'm not sure how it's going to reveal itself, but hopefully it will soon.
Thank you. I think this may be also a good point to wrap up, because we sort of reached the limit of time. Of course, we're online, so we could be talking forever, but we did set some terms and conditions for ourselves. So yeah, thank you so much, Kira, for this very interesting chat.
Thank you so much, Stella.
And thank you everyone at E-WERK for hosting us. And yeah, see you very soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.